It is my privilege to conclude our time this morning and our time this weekend looking at the final leg of Christian and hopeful's journey to the celestial city. And I wanted to begin just simply by saying I hope this conference has been profitable. The last couple of days has been profitable to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd also like to take a minute. Just a second. Where's Brett? Is Brett out there? I would like to take a minute. Brett, can you come in here for a second? Just because Brett's going to thank everybody but himself. And so can we just take a minute to thank Brett for all the work he's done to put this on? Yeah, I know this is a highlight for a lot of people, and so I just wanted to thank him before we get going. And I hope this weekend's been good for you. If you've never read The Pilgrim's Progress, or if you haven't read it in a long time, or simply weren't kind of overly familiar with it before this weekend, I hope you've gained some valuable understanding of what is really a classic. It's really a classic work of the whole Western canon of literature, but particularly Christian literature. And that if you haven't read it yet, which is fine, no shame, but if you haven't read it, hopefully this weekend gives you kind of a good foundation to read it and get some good value out of it. During my study and during the conference, I've grown in my appreciation of John Bunyan and this masterpiece. And particularly, I've found that what I appreciate about it is it's sort of the combination of deep joy and deep seriousness that sort of sets the tone of this story. They're both present. And if you're here for Brett's talk, you know that the Puritans, the Puritan movement was sort of in its heyday. It was actually sort of moving to America around the time Bunyan was born. But the Puritans were prevalent around the time of Bunyan, and he sort of has his roots in Puritanism. And if you've ever read the works of the Puritans, you'll notice that they take both their sin, their ongoing struggle with sin, and the grace of God really, really, really seriously, like both of those things. And it's like really jarring. They're really honest about their own sin, but then they're really just some of what they say about the gospel and about the work of God in the believer's life is some of the most beautiful stuff on those subjects. And so they take both really seriously. They're not shy to delve into the imperfect workings of the Christian heart, which, though it's in the process of being sanctified, still struggles with inclinations toward ungodliness. And yet they speak with equal weight and conviction about the sufficiency of the person and the work of Christ to overcome all of our failings, past, present, and future. And so if you've never read Puritan works, I would encourage you to. A good place to start is it's called The Valley of Vision, it's a collection of Puritan prayers. And you get this sort of, this dual sense of just a high view, a serious view of our ongoing struggle with sin and a high view of salvation. Their writings are shot through with a deep recognition of that ongoing struggle and an ardent desire to grow in righteousness, as well as an abiding sense of joy and rest in the grace of God on which all their hope and all their effort in pursuing Christ is based. So I love this aspect of the Puritan works because it strikes me as realistic, which is refreshing, but also it strikes me as biblical, deeply biblical. I believe that this tone or this aspect of their writings, it's the product of honest, devout men wrestling with the dual realities that Christ has won the decisive battle of salvation. He's won the decisive battle of salvation, and yet the war between the Christian and the world, the flesh, and the devil still rages on with intensity. And 1 John 1, 8 through 9, I think, captures these dual realities and provides sort of the definitive instruction on how the Christian is to walk through the world in light of these dual realities. And he says this: if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. We say we don't have any sin that we're dealing with anymore as Christians. We deceive ourselves. We're lying to ourselves. There's an ongoing struggle with sin. So we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness, which of course is all based on the work of Christ on our behalf. The work of Christ on our behalf. So these verses, they give us the Christian way through the world kind of in a nutshell. We struggle with sin, sometimes overcoming sin, and sometimes succumbing to the temptations of sin. And when we succumb, our response is we confess. We confess. We confess and receive the just and faithful forgiveness of God, and his ongoing work in us is allowed to continue. And so the decisive victory has been won, but the war is still intense. And at an experiential level, the war even seems to us to be in doubt at times. In doubt at times, even though it never truly is in doubt. But our experience sometimes is that it is. And that, to me, just that sort of encapsulation of those dual realities, that's, to me, is a fair way of summing up the storyline of the Pilgrim's Progress. Because Christian's journey is full of trial and temptation and even failings, where he gets led astray or he gets injured in some way. And yet, he makes slow progress, right? The Pilgrim's progress toward the celestial city. And it's progress that Bunyan unfailingly attributes to the grace of God in some way. It's always some acting on the grace of God. It's an angel showing up or some other character that comes in and sets Christian back on the right path by the grace of God. And so, Pilgrim's Progress has this tone of grave seriousness, which befits that ongoing struggle with sin, and a tone of indomitable hope, which befits the grace that accompanies Christian throughout his journey. But such a journey that deals with those two realities seriously takes perseverance. It's a jarring journey where you're dealing with the incredible grace of God, but also the incredible struggle that we go through at the same time. And so that kind of journey takes perseverance. And I would say, perhaps more than any other virtue, perseverance is what characterizes Christian throughout this journey, right? We've talked a lot about this weekend just about how dangerous the Christian life is and how perilous the journey is. And it's sort of been implied and sometimes stated throughout the conference that perseverance is so key to that journey because it's so difficult. And so, seeing that this is the Reformation conference, I thought it would be fitting to tie our consideration of these final chapters of the Pilgrim's Progress with a crucial doctrine of the Reformation, namely the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints. The perseverance of the saints. And I want to look at the necessity of that doctrine and kind of how that doctrine plays itself out in experience. And how important it is for finishing the Christian journey well. So first, I want to pray real quick, and then we'll recap the final chapters of the story before we talk about that. Jesus, I'm so thankful for just the theme that sort of pervaded this conference, not only in the talks, but even in what we've sung, which is that you are the basis of our hope. That you are the basis of our assurance, because you are the basis of our salvation, because all of our salvation is based on you. You are the foundation of it all, and so I thank you for even just how you've worked in orchestrating these things to be pointing to you, to be pointing to the necessity of basing all we do, our entire walk, our entire hope, our entire salvation on you, Jesus. So I thank you for that theme. I pray that as we go through these final chapters, as we consider these final things, that would continue to be the theme, and that we would see that so much of our Christian walk simply boils down to staying close to you, and to coming back to what you've done for us on the cross, and that being our way of making progress in the faith. And so I just pray that you would bless this time, and would you be glorified in it, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So Grant's sort of section left off at Doubting Castle. And I want to talk just briefly about Doubting Castle, because I think it gives us some important context for what comes next. Doubting Castle is the abode of giant despair and his wife distrust. And it's a place where Christian and hopeful, they're deprived of food and water, they're thrown in a dungeon and deprived of light, they're beaten mercilessly, and they're tempted even to take their own lives, like the giant puts it in their minds, like maybe you should just commit suicide. So it's a really dark part of the journey. And this stop on their journey, it portrays what has sometimes been called elsewhere the dark night of the soul for the Christian, which is where a Christian goes through a season of intense doubt. It's when God seems far away, spiritual nourishment is lacking, the way forward is dark and unknown, and despair wreaks havoc on the Christian. And often in such seasons, a Christian is left to wonder, what is God doing in this? Like, what are you doing in this? What is this accomplishing? It seems like you're just far away and I don't have what I need to make it through the journey, the path ahead. I think C.S. Lewis provides one of the best explanations of the purpose behind these types of seasons. In his work, The Screwtape Letters, which if you're unfamiliar with that collector, that work, it's a series of fictional letters that one demon writes to another with the purpose of the elder demon sort of training up this less experienced demon and tempting people, basically. So it's a fictitious work that Lewis uses to sort of explore, like, what are the goals of hell in tempting us and what are the goals of God. And so Lewis writes in this work, as Screwtape, one of the demons, he says, "Do not be deceived, Wormwood," which is the other demon. "Our cause," so that's the cause of hell, "is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will," that's God's will, "looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys." So you've got to do a little bit of mental gymnastics because of how Lewis set this whole thing up. But the point he's trying to make here is that God uses times of spiritual dryness, times when it seems as though every trace of God has disappeared from our universe, to teach us to obey based on trust and not on our feelings. That's what he uses these times of darkness and dryness for, is to trust the promises of God over our own feelings. And this is a massive step in the sanctification process when we learn to trust the promises of God in spite of what our feelings may be telling us in a given season. And it's a necessary step on the road to Christian maturity in this life. And Christian and hopeful take this step in their development, and it results in their release from Doubting Castle in the clutches of despair. They escape when Christian remembers that he has this key in his pocket. He calls it the key of promise, which unlocks all the doors of Doubting Castle. And so this is why I think that exploring the role of doubt and promise in the Christian journey, and in this particular stage of the journey for Christian and hopeful in the story, is important, because the last leg of their journey, the two sort of main places they're going to go, are the Delectable Mountains and the land of Beulah, which are two sort of regions of relative Christian maturity, which they only gain access to by experiencing and breaking out of Doubting Castle by the key of promise. And so, to put it another way, the key of promise not only unlocks the doors out of Doubting Castle, not only unlocks the door out of doubt, but it unlocks the door into maturity. So it unlocks the door out of doubt, but into maturity. But that's not to say that Christian and hopeful are now past all peril on their journey. The first region, as I said, sort of region of maturity, and by the way, that's my region of maturity, that's my phrase, that's not Bunyan, so just know that. But the first region of maturity is the Delectable Mountains, and their time there makes it clear that there are still dangers ahead of them. Upon arriving in these mountains, our two pilgrims, they encounter the shepherds of knowledge, experience, watchful, and sincere. And you'll notice as you kind of look at those characteristics, knowledge, experience, watchfulness, and sincerity, those are the kinds of qualities that you pick up when you go through a season of doubt. And they're certainly marks of a mature Christian faith that has been tested by life. And those qualities, they help us shepherd our own souls and the souls of others on the right way. And so the Delectable Mountains are yet another sort of shadow of the church, or another sort of iteration of the church, because they provide a foretaste of heaven with sort of the abundance of good things that's available there. They also provide a glimpse of the celestial city itself. But they're also a place of warning and instruction. So these four shepherds, they take the two men through to four different spots in the mountains. They take them to the hills of error and caution, and then they show them a door in the side of a hill that leads to hell. And then finally they give them that glimpse of the celestial city from the top of Clear Hill, or Mount Clear as it appears on the PowerPoint here. And before they depart, the shepherds give them a map. So then they give them, there's like four part things in all the Delectable Mountains. So they give them four things as they depart from the Delectable Mountains. One is a map of the way. The second is a warning against the flatterer. The third is a warning against sleeping on the enchanted ground. And then the fourth is just a parting blessing of Godspeed. And through this sort of tour of the four spots in the Delectable Mountains and the giving of these four kind of gifts in the Delectable Mountains, the shepherds are trying to prepare Christian and hopeful for what lies ahead of them. And as we will see, that attempt to prepare them is moderately successful. Upon coming out of the Delectable Mountains, Christian and hopeful, they enter an unnamed land, but it's where they meet ignorance near the place where a crooked path comes down from the town of Deceit. And I want to spend a minute on ignorance because he's important. He enters the story 3 times. Ignorance enters the story 3 times. And is an important contrast to our pilgrims, especially when it comes to the topic of his assurance of salvation. He's a really interesting contrast. Ignorance comes from the town of Conceit. He entered the highway not through the wicket gate that then takes you to the way of the cross, but he enters by an easy, crooked path that comes down and enters the way. Upon meeting ignorance and hearing that he too is trying to go to the celestial city, Christian strikes up a conversation and he asks ignorance how he plans to gain entrance when he reaches the city. Specifically, Christian asks what ignorance plans to show at the gate of the city. He asks him, what do you plan to show at the gate of the city? Which is a reference to the scroll or the certificate that Christian received at the cross. Brian talked about this. He received sort of 4 things at the cross, right? His burden was removed. He received the righteousness of Christ, new clothes. He received a mark on his forehead and received this scroll, which was his assurance. And so this scroll represents the assurance of Christian's salvation. And we see this after the hill of difficulty, when Christian loses his scroll for a time, and he comes back and he finds his scroll. Bunyan shares the significance of it. He writes, "The scroll was the assurance of his life and acceptance at the celestial city." So the scroll or certificate, it's called both throughout the story, represents the assurance of Christian's salvation and his eventual acceptance into heaven. So this scroll serves as this record or this reminder of Christian's encounter of the cross, which is where he received salvation. And it serves as a reminder throughout the rest of the story. In other words, it's the symbol of salvation by grace founded on the work of Jesus dying and rising for Christian. So this scroll, this scroll is all important for his goal, right? It's the all-important ticket that will gain him admittance into heaven. Okay, that's what this scroll is to Christian, and therefore he's wondering if ignorance has one, because this is the way in. This is the way in. And it's clear from their first conversation that ignorance doesn't. He believes that his good works and his religious observances will suffice to gain him entrance into the celestial city. And so he has no way to have a certificate or a scroll. He has no need to have a certificate or a scroll. He has no need to enter through the wicket gate and come by the way of the cross, because he's found a nice, easy way down to the path from his town of conceit. Christian and hopeful, they perceive that ignorance is just set in his ways, and then he's not going to hear what they have to say, and so they decide that for the time being, what's best is they're gonna part company from him. They're gonna hope that he kind of considers what they've said at further length and starts to reconsider his own position, and so they leave him. After leaving ignorance, they see, there's this brief scene where they see a character called Turnaway who's being carried away, bound by 7 demons. And this, seeing him carried away, reminds Christian of another man named Little Faith from the town of Sincere. And Christian goes to tell how Little Faith was a pilgrim who was robbed by the thieves' faint heart, mistrust, and guilt. And because he was robbed of almost everything he had, his pilgrimage was really, really, really difficult. He had to beg the whole way, but he did remain faithful. Little Faith did remain faithful. And so the contrast here between Little Faith and Turnaway is clearly meant to show the significant difference between one who has no true faith and so turns away when he's tried, and one who even has a little bit of true faith who cannot help but continue on to the celestial city because of that little bit of true faith. And so with this introduction of ignorance, Turnaway, and Little Faith, Bunyan, he's touching on this idea. Again, he's sort of, the perseverance and assurance of faith has been a theme, as you've heard throughout the talks. It's been a theme throughout the book, but Bunyan's starting to play with it a little bit with some of these other characters. He's starting to offer a commentary on it, which we'll address a little bit more deeply later on. So after this story of Little Faith, they have this kind of conversation about not judging weaker brothers, essentially, who lack great faith. And then Christian and hopeful, they come to this fork in the road, and they're unsure of where to go. As they're at this fork in the road trying to decide which path to take, they are met by the flatterer in disguise. And this flatterer cheerfully encourages them to follow him because he too is going to the celestial city. And so he starts to lead them. They start following him down one of the forks in the road. But he leads them astray, and they are eventually ensnared in this net, in the net of the flatterer. And after lying ensnared in this net for a while, they're rescued by a shining one or an angel who frees them from the net. He then chastises them for neglecting the shepherd's instructions. Remember, the shepherds had given them a map of the way, so they didn't look at that at the fork in the road. And he warned them against the flatterer, and they kind of forgot about that, and so they fell right into the flatterer's trap. That's why the shepherd's shepherding was sort of moderately successful. And so he chastises them. He actually whips them a little bit to kind of make the lesson sink in. And then he returns them to the right path, this angel. And the angel's lesson sticks because they almost immediately see another person coming down the path. He's got his back to the celestial city, Bunyan says, and he's coming towards them on the path. And they're immediately suspicious of this next character. They're worried he's going to be another flatterer, which is good because this person ends up being atheist. This person ends up being atheist who's walking away from the celestial city, right? He's got his back to the city, and hopeful does eventually mark him as one of the flatterers. Atheist finds their search of the celestial city humorous, hilarious, in fact, because he says there is no such place. There's no such place as the celestial city, and he claims that he would know because he's been looking for it longer than they have, and he hasn't found it, so it must not be there. So he finds it really funny that they're trying to look for a place that doesn't exist. And at first, Christian feigns consideration of what atheist says. Christian makes it sound like he's actually considering the possibility that the celestial city doesn't exist, but it's actually just a test of hopeful. He's just sort of testing hopeful. And hopeful immediately rejects the idea that there is no celestial city because even though they're at this place in the path where they can't see the celestial city right now, and so they're walking by faith, he says, we have seen it. We've had a glimpse of it. We know it's there. We know it's there, and we also know that we've been called to walk by faith when we can't see it. And so they reject what atheist is saying, and they continue on. And it's after they leave Atheist that they enter the enchanted ground. And they almost succumb to the drowsiness of the place, this sort of spell of drowsiness that the place casts over people. They almost succumb before remembering the shepherd's warning of the place. Hopeful is actually wanting to kind of take a nap here, and Christian, though, remembers that the shepherds had warned them not to. And so they strike up a conversation to keep themselves alert. Which is actually, this is just sort of a fun fact. This is actually a really Puritan kind of part of the story. It's the Puritans had what they called the Christian Conference, which was basically just edifying conversation between Christians. And I thought that was interesting. And so that's what they're having here. They're having a good Puritan Christian conference to keep themselves alert. And the first part of their conversation is the story of Hopeful's conversion. And if you read this part, after you've heard Brett's talk just about Bunyan's conversion, Hopeful's conversion is very, very similar. He comes from Hopeful, if you remember from Grant's talk, came from Vanity Fair. So he relates how he grew up enjoying the pleasures of Vanity Fair, but then became convicted of his sin, and which eventually drove him, well, actually, just like Bunyan, originally drove him into self-righteousness and morality and hypocrisy, but eventually drove him in desperation to truly trust in Jesus. And Hopeful's testimony of utterly despairing of his own righteousness, and so casting himself fully on the righteousness of Christ for salvation, is really important for what comes next, which is their second encounter with ignorance. Bunyan uses this second conversation with ignorance to show that his assurance of salvation, ignorance's assurance of salvation, is ultimately based on his own good works and the feeling of his heart, rather than the word of God. And so in contrast to Hopeful's testimony of his salvation, ignorance reveals that he lacks a basic understanding of his own depravity, of his own helplessness to save himself, as well as a basic understanding of Christ's sufficiency. And those two things go hand in hand, right? If we think we have something to offer, then what Christ has to offer us is not as big of a deal as if we have nothing to offer and Christ offers us everything, right? So those two things go hand in hand. And so his resulting sort of belief system is that his works, so that ignorance, his own works, justify him because they have been made acceptable by Christ's merit, okay? And so in his own words, he says this: I believe that Christ makes my religious duties acceptable to his Father by virtue of his merits, and so shall I be justified. So what he's saying is that ultimately he's justified by his works. Ultimately, ignorance thinks he's justified by his works, and his works are pretty good. They need to be cleaned up a little bit, and so Christ's merit kind of does that work. That part of it, Christ's merit kind of polishes his own good works, and then they're acceptable to the Father, and he's justified by his good works. That's sort of his conception of his faith. And Christian points out that this is the core problem with his faith, saying, the faith you describe makes Christ a justifier of your actions, not of your person. Makes Christ a justifier of your actions and not of your person. Thus, according to this faith, you are justified by your actions, which is false. You're not justified by your actions, is what he says. And that, in a nutshell, is how ignorance is conceitedly ignorant. He's from conceit and he's ignorance. He's conceitedly ignorant because he pridefully thinks he's pretty good. He pridefully thinks, I can just about make it on my own. I need Christ to help me out a little bit, but still it's going to be my works that get me in. It's going to be my works that get me in. So he pridefully thinks he's good, and therefore he is ignorant of his true need and what Christ truly offers him in the way of salvation. And so once again, despite their best efforts, ignorance remains unconvinced of the truth. Ignorance remains unconvinced and they part company again. So they leave him, Christian and Hopeful. They return to their conversation that they were carrying on to remain alert with a consideration of the story of Temporary and Turnback, both of whom abandoned their faith. After this, they finally get past the enchanted ground and they enter the country of Beulah. And this country is within sight of the city. They can see the celestial city from this country. It's a place full of good things for them to enjoy. In this place, they sort of simultaneously have their joy and their salvation increases, but their desire for the celestial city also increases. They become sick with desire to make it to the celestial city, even as their salvation, like their sort of present joy in their salvation, is at its highest point. And I think this to me, this section represents sort of full-flowered Christian maturity in this life. Full-flowered Christian maturity in this life, in which we are able to enjoy the best that Christianity has to offer this side of heaven, but it leaves us desperately desiring to reach the heavenly kingdom and be with the Lord. I think that's what Christian maturity looks like. One is we're more contented in the Lord than we've ever been, and yet we want to be with the Lord more than we ever have. And I think that's what Beulah represents. And it's at this point that the reader sort of anticipates that Christian and hopeful, they're just sort of going to easily complete their journey. They're just going to sort of waltz up the rest of the way to the celestial city, enter into glory. But that's not how it goes. There are still two more obstacles they have to navigate. The first is the river of death, which borders the country of Beulah, and the second is the gate of the city. Those are the two obstacles left. And when they come to the river of death, there are two angels there, and they tell them that the only way to the celestial city is through this river of death, with very few exceptions. They mention Elijah and Enoch, but they say basically everybody has to go through the river. They also say that there's no way to tell how hard the crossing will be for a given person. For some, it is a sore trial, and for others, it's relatively easier, at least easier than for the ones for whom it's a really difficult trial. And it proves manageable for hopeful. He finds it's fairly shallow for where he's at. He finds pretty solid footing through the river. But it nearly kills the faith of Christian as the memory of his past sins begin to overwhelm him and start to kind of push him down and threaten to drown him. It's a really sore trial. But hopeful brings him hope. Hopeful brings him hope. He reminds Christian that no matter what, Christ will make him whole in the end. So he basically says, no. It's not about you being whole right now. It's not about you being perfect right now. It's about the fact that Christ is going to make you perfect in the end. He reminds him of that. He reminds him that he's not perfect right now, but Christ will make him whole in the end. And with that, Christian is able to see. He sees Jesus calling him to keep coming through the river. And upon seeing Jesus beckon him on, he finds more solid footing in the river, and they're able to make it across. And then comes their final ascent to the celestial city. And this climb for them is between the river and the gate. There's sort of this heavenly welcoming committee that comes out, and they're singing and they're worshiping, and it's full of joy and excitement and anticipation. As they anticipate what's to come, they ask the angel, "What must we do? What must we do when we get into the city?" And I love this reply from the angel. He says, "You must receive the comforts of all your toil. You must have joy for all your sorrow. You must reap what you have sown, even the fruit of all your prayers, tears, and suffering in your journey for the King." It's one of my favorite lines in the entire book, because what the Shining One is saying here is essentially that our duty in heaven is to delight. Our duty in heaven is to delight in the reward we receive. And mainly, we're to delight in the presence of Jesus. And so, finally, they reach the gate of the city, which is the last obstacle, although it proves really to be no obstacle for them because they present their certificates. Remember that scroll? They present their certificates that they received at the cross. Those are taken in to the king, who immediately says, "Open the gate, bring them in." And they enter in and are transfigured and join the heavenly throng. And Christian and hopeful reach the goal of their salvation. But that's not the end of the book. It's not the end of the story. Following their entrance, which is the high point of the most glorious point of the story, is Bunyan as he gets a glimpse through the gates of heaven. But following that, we have our third and final encounter with ignorance. Ignorance shows up one more time. And he crosses the river of death. He actually gets across fairly easy because there's a ferryman by the name of Vain Hope who just gives him a ride. And so he actually gets across the river really easily. And he starts to make his way up to the gate, but it's really different. It's really different. All of a sudden, where for Christian and Hopeful, there was this huge welcoming committee, and it was kind of like this party on the way up to the gate. But for Ignorance, nobody's there. It's just silent. He's just on his own, walking up to the gate. So nobody's there for some reason. And then, of course, at the gate, it's discovered that Ignorance doesn't have a certificate. He doesn't have a certificate. And so he's bound and delivered to the door on the side of the hill. He's taken away and delivered to the door on the side of the hill. And this is the second to last line in the story. Then I saw that there was a way to hell from the gates of heaven, as well as from the city of destruction. And then the narrator wakes up, and the story ends. That's how it ends. It's kind of a shocking ending, isn't it? I mean, as soon as we see Ignorance coming, we kind of know something bad is going to happen. But it's a shocking ending, and it's sobering. It's sobering, and it's unexpected. And I think it begs the question, he's dealt with assurance, obviously, throughout the whole story. And so what does it mean for Bunyan? What does assurance mean for Bunyan? This ending shows that Bunyan believes the Christian journey is perilous from start to finish. It's perilous from start to finish. And is perhaps the most forceful example of that mixed tone I mentioned at the beginning. We witness Christian and Hopeful enter into glory, and then we're reminded that some reach the gate of glory and are essentially told by the king, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness." But this is really just the last in a series of examples that show this mixed tone. The Delectable Mountains, they were a place of refreshment, but also a place of warning. The Enchanted Ground was this place of threatening drowsiness, but it was also a place of sweet fellowship. The land of Beulah offered the best of earthly Christian blessing, but it ended with the ominous river of death. So Bunyan, and he's made it clear throughout the entire journey that the pilgrim's journey is one of blessing and danger, joy and sorrow, ease and difficulty, from the first step of the journey to the last. It's this mix. And I think this provides a commentary on his conception of what assurance really looks like. For Bunyan, assurance of salvation doesn't mean that once you've prayed the sinner's prayer, you can just kind of throw things into cruise control for the rest of the way. And don't misunderstand, Bunyan absolutely believes in assurance of salvation, as is clear from the story of little Faith, who had just the smallest amount of true faith, and yet how Bunyan characterizes him is that he couldn't turn back if he wanted to. Well, he couldn't turn back because he couldn't want to, I guess. So he believes in assurance of salvation. But for Bunyan, assurance is something that the Christian is actively called to bring to mind. And more importantly, it's proven by perseverance. It's proven by, I think, that virtue that most characterizes Christian, which is persevering through the perils of his journey. Remember, as Brian talked about, Christian received his certificate of assurance at the cross. But the rest of his journey is still perilous, and his reaching of the celestial city is never portrayed as like a foregone conclusion. You never get that sense in the story. You never get that sense in the story. In fact, Bunyan kind of plays with this idea of assurance, starting with the hill of difficulty, where Christian loses his assurance. He loses his assurance. He has to go back and find it. He has to return and go and find his assurance again, which is sort of interesting. And I was actually thinking too, one of the other signs of his assurance was a mark on his forehead, which the thing about a mark on your forehead is you can't see it. You can't see it. You got to trust it's there. You've got to trust it's there. And so I think what he's talking about here, just kind of a note, like Bunyan's not talking about whether or not our salvation is assured from the time we put our trust in Jesus. What he's talking about is our experience of our assurance, which is that sometimes it is a wrestling match to hold on to our assurance. And if we fall asleep in the arbor on the hill of difficulty, sometimes we forget our assurance and we leave it behind. And then we run into difficulty and we're sent back. And we have to go back. We have to return to the cross. We have to return to the cross and find that assurance again. And so assurance is not just, it's not this thing that is always characterized by like an overabundance of confidence. The one character who does consider acceptance at the city a foregone conclusion for him is ignorance. Christian and hopeful, they can't even, like he won't hear word one from them because he is so sure that his faith will save him. He's so sure of his salvation that even death doesn't faze him. He gets across easier than hopeful or Christian but his hope is vain. That's the problem. The assurance of ignorance smacks of the assurance that many people have even today. Many people have today. The assurance that some are assured because they can't fathom, Brian talked about this some, they can't fathom that God would reject a good person. They cannot fathom that God would reject a good person, never stopping to question whether our hearts are actually capable of judging who's a good person. Never stopping to question whether our hearts are just deceiving us by telling us we're a good person, so surely God will accept us. Some are assured and many claim to have faith in Jesus, never stopping to question whether they're simply adding Jesus to a faith system of their own self-righteous invention, just like ignorance again. Jesus was there. If you go back and read their conversations, like he trusted in Jesus for justification, but he trusted Jesus to justify his own works. So in the end, he'd made up a system of salvation, and Christ was a part of it, but he'd just sort of been added in. His whole salvation was not based on Christ. Some hear the phrase assurance of salvation, and they think it means that if they accepted Jesus into their heart as a child, then they are bound to heaven, regardless of how they live thereafter. I prayed the sinner's prayer. I'm good. It doesn't really matter how I live from here on out. Never stopping to question the contradiction between Jesus coming into a heart and that heart being unchanged. That's a contradiction. Jesus doesn't come into a heart and leave it unchanged. That's incongruous. And this is maybe a weakness of phrasing the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints as assurance of salvation, at least in our day and age. Or another phrase that gets used sometimes is eternal security. Now, those phrases are still getting at truth. Don't hear me wrong here. But the phrases can be misleading, and many people do misunderstand them. They think it means that once a person has professed faith, they're guaranteed heaven. Once they've professed faith, they're guaranteed heaven. It doesn't matter how they live. It doesn't matter what their life looks like after that. The problem is, what if that professed faith is false? Like ignorance is. What if the professed faith is false? And that leads to another question, which is, how can you tell? How can you tell if the professed faith is false? And I think one of the best answers is, again, as I've sort of been saying, is the theme of the book, which is perseverance. I think that's one of the ways you tell if your assurance is true or false. Do you persevere in relying on the work of Christ to save you? Or do you start to feel like you've got something to offer, something substantial to offer God in and of yourself? Or do you persevere in reliance on Christ? After receiving the certificate at the cross, Christian again encountered the hill of difficulty. He makes it up part of the way up the hill, like I said, and he falls asleep in this arbor. And after he's looked at the certificate, he actually looks at the certificate, and then he falls asleep and he drops it. He awakes, he sets off without it, he encounters trouble and discovers he's forgotten his certificate, which forces him to backtrack and get the scroll back. And so this is like this picture of him neglecting neglecting the basis of his assurance, neglecting and basing the rest of his journey on the cross. He forgets it. He forgets his experience of the cross, and he goes on and he realizes he doesn't have what it takes to continue the journey because he's forgotten the cross. He's forgotten the cross. And so he has to go back and he has to rediscover his assurance based on the cross. And from then on, after he loses it, he's much more careful with it for the rest of the journey. Paul says it this way in Galatians 3:3. He says, "Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh?" So this is what Christians sort of began to do. In the context here, in the context of Galatians, Paul he's talking about the Spirit giving the Galatians faith in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And Paul's saying that the ongoing work of sanctification, so the ongoing journey of the Christian, is based on the cross just as much as our initial justification was. Sanctification is based on Jesus dying for us on the cross just as much as our initial justification was. And so Christianity is not just, we trust in Jesus for our justification and then we kind of forget about what he did on the cross. But we are to persevere in reliance on the cross of Christ as the basis of our salvation. I'm going to skip down a little bit because we're running short on time. But that's the main point, though. The main point I wanted to make is that the journey is that the perseverance of a Christian is a perseverance in relying on the grace of Jesus from start to finish. And so I don't think the ignorance of ignorance, the ignorance, little I, of ignorance, big I character, was that he felt in his heart that he was saved, right? There are passages in the Bible, Romans 8:16 says that the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. That sounds similar to what ignorance says. But the problem was that his feeling was not corroborated by the Word of God. It wasn't consistent with the Word of God. As Christians said to ignorance, "You believe in a fantasy faith, for this faith is nowhere described in the Word." And so it wasn't necessarily that he felt like his heart was telling him he was saved. The problem was that his concept of salvation did not align with what the Word of God had revealed. So the ignorance of ignorance was that he failed to question his heart and to test it by the Word of God. Through all this, Bunyan shows what the Bible reveals, which is that a Christian has assurance in the cross of Christ, and that assurance is proved by perseverance. The Christian has assurance in the cross of Christ, and that assurance is proved by perseverance. And if you think through the conference, we've talked about the faithfulness of Jesus. I think it was Brian who brought up the Great Commission and how Jesus promises us that he will never leave us or forsake us. Like, that's where the assurance is. Our assurance is not based on our ability to hold on to Jesus. Our assurance is based on Jesus' ability to hold on to us, and that's proven by us persevering in a difficult walk of faith. It's my conviction that the tension between our faith in the gracious salvation we have in Jesus and our ongoing struggle with the world, the flesh, and the devil is meant to produce a healthy tension in us. It's meant to produce a healthy tension in us that sends us back to the cross, and by that way, forward into Christian maturity and toward the goal of our salvation. I think that's what we see in Christian in his journey here, is all the perils of his journey, all the dangers that he encounters. He either doesn't handle them right, or he goes back to the grace of God. Like they're trying to send him back to the grace of God, and that's how the pilgrim makes progress, is by returning to the grace of God over and over and over again. And that's how he makes progress. And so it's sort of, I personally think it's sort of paradoxical, but I think that's what the Bible also reveals. And I'm just going to end with a couple passages from Philippians. Philippians 2:12 through 13 says this: "Work out your own faith with fear and trembling." With fear and trembling. It sounds a lot like Christian's journey. "For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." And this forms the basis for Paul's confidence in Philippians 1:6 when he says, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion on the day of Jesus Christ. Such is our assurance that God is at work in us. And he will bring that work to completion. But it's because he's at work in us that we work out our faith with fear and trembling. That's our assurance, and that's why we're called to persevere. So may we persevere in it, in our assurance as faithful pilgrims, looking back to the assurance we have in the cross and looking forward to our celestial home.